music, all sorts of things like that. Those digital assets that we have now, that they will remain usable for us well into the future. So, we're going to have slides any moment because there's some pictures I want to show you. I hope. Enterprise PCs have become incredibly process heavy. For those of you who work for a company like the company I work for, there are all sorts of reasons for it, but to boot a PC, there are all sorts of virus checks and things like that that go off at a moment's notice, and they last for half hours. I hope we've avoided them. Okay, so digital preservation. So I have a couple of photos here just to set the tone for the talk. These are all storage media, storage devices. The two on the right are very old, and they are analog storage devices. The two on the left here are very much more recent, digital storage devices. And one of the interesting things here is that the content stored in the two old ones on the right is actually a lot more accessible in many ways to us now than the content stored in the two much newer ones on the left. So this is one of the paradoxes of the digital age, and why, one example of why digital preservation is interesting and important. So, a brief outline. We'll be talking a little bit more about the goals of digital preservation and why it's hard. And then we'll talk about some possible solutions and approaches for handling it and how we might evaluate those. And then we'll finish up with, if there's time, with a description of some of the projects I've been involved with in the area and some open problems and opportunities that I hope will get all of you, lined up wanting to solve this problem. So, why are we worried about this now? There are a lot of digital assets now that we want to be able to keep around for a long period of time. This has really been creeping up on us, and we're at the tip of the iceberg in terms of this problem. Some of the problem is compliance related. There's a lot of legislation here and abroad about the kinds of records that we have to keep for many decades. So lots of examples here. HIPAA is the one from the medical industry, where we are obliged to keep medical records for patients for at least the length of their lifetime. A lot of people live quite a long time, and you don't get to shut down your patient just because your medical record system bit the dust. And lots of other kinds of legislation as well. There are also a lot of applications we have now, a lot of web services out there that people are using to create and store content like digital photos, movies, music, things that they used to have in analog form, like the photos in my grandma's photo album, that they want to be able to keep around indefinitely. How do we know that the photos we're going to store out there on Facebook or Snapfish or something like that, how do we know how long they're going to last? What can we do about that? There are also a lot of archives out there and fixed content repositories. I've listed a few of some of the important kinds out there that have quite a bit of scale to them. But for example, national libraries are chartered with preserving the intellectual property of their countries for as long as those countries exist. So there are a lot of folks who are hoping they need to do that forever. So lots of reasons why we have stuff we want to keep. There was a survey, a very interesting survey recently done by the Storage Networking Industry Association, that's SNIA. So if you're interested in storage, this is the standards group to look at. They did a survey of a lot of different storage customers out there, and they found that over half of them had content inside their enterprises or organizations that they wanted to keep for at least 100 years. And the vast majority of content they wanted to keep, for some reason, for at least 50 years. And it wasn't necessarily much content in a lot of those cases, but it became clear that the storage industry has to help these people do this somehow. I think a lot of us probably have a definition in our mind of what digital preservation means, but I find actually when I talk to people it's really quite different from person to person. So I thought, just to get us on the same page, I describe what I mean by it. What I mean is that the digital assets that we have now should remain accessible and usable and undamaged for as long as we want to keep them around, which is, in many cases, beyond the lifetime of any particular storage system or any particular storage technology, and although I didn't list it here, probably beyond the lifetime of any particular storage vendor. And we want to be able to do this at low cost. The material needs to be accessible to us in the future. We have to be able to get at it. There's no point in having to sort it off in some salt mine or something like that. It needs to be usable. We can't make sense of it when we get our hands on it, and then again, the exercise is pointless. And it needs to be undamaged, because some of the damage can make it hard for us to use it, and some of the damage, if we don't know about it, maybe the material was attacked in some way, could mean it's changed in its content in some way that will cause us great embarrassment before we realize what's at stake. So this is what we want to do: accessible, usable, undamaged material for as long as we want to keep it. So why is this hard? There are a lot of threats to long-term digital content. And if you talk to people who work in this area, there'll be all sorts of different ways of categorizing these threats. This is a way that I've categorized them that's proved useful for me and my colleagues in a kind of a day-to-day basis working in the area. So I've grouped things into 3 sections here in terms of threats. The first, the ones in blue, these are things that also affect short-term content. It's just that the longer the desired lifetime of the content we want to keep, the more likely these problems are to happen to that content. The things in green here are things that also happen to short-term content, but there's something about our wanting to keep the content around for longer that changes the nature of the threat or how we have to address it. So things start to get a little interesting here. And the things in red there are things that are threats really only because we're trying to keep the content around for a long time. And we don't have time to go through all of these, so I thought I'd just pull out one from each group to talk about unless people have questions. So feel free to interrupt with questions about any of them. So in terms of things that affect short-term and long-term content, but are going to be more increasingly a problem the longer you try to keep something, the media faults are damage to the actual storage medium that you've stored the bits on. And the problem here is that there is no affordable digital storage medium that doesn't degrade over time. There are all sorts of measurements about how long things can last, but they all go to pieces after a while. So an example would be CD-ROMs. A lot of people use these as an archival storage mechanism, put their baby photos on it, their wedding videos, all sorts of things like that. And in a lot of cases, although it's better now, in a lot of cases the dyes on the surfaces of these would degrade over time. They eventually will, but in many cases it was in between 2 to 5 years after the material was stored on those CDs, which is not much time in the scheme of things. So a lot of people have lost a lot of baby photos and things that way. So maybe not the best archival medium, but it knew it looked like a good one. And it's gotten better lately, but it's still an issue. So we'll talk a little bit more about media faults in a bit. In this group, I pulled out attack. I think this is very interesting. As system designers, we worry a lot about defending the systems we build from relatively intense, but also short-lived kinds of attacks that we'll notice. In the digital preservation arena, things are different. It can instead be an attack that's not very intense. It's very low grade. We might not notice it, but it's a very long-term, very patient attack. How are we going to find those and defend ourselves from those? When I started working with libraries, I was surprised to find that libraries are always under attack. They always have been. Not something I knew. So there are, and always have been, organizations out there that are well-funded, well-organized, that for ideological or religious or political reasons object to some of the materials that are stored in those repositories and are willing to take a decades-long view towards removing that material or destroying it or replacing it with their own material. In this country, Darwin's Origin of the Species is an example. Libraries are always having to squirrel away extra copies and things like that. So this is an area that brings out new problems when you try to do things for a long period of time and defend a system and keep it safe for a long period of time. And then I'll venture to say that as young as a lot of you are here, you may already have experienced some kind of obsolescence. You stored something maybe on a 3.5-inch floppy, or you know somebody who has, and now you can't find a reader for it. So obsolescence of hardware or software might be a software format you can't find the application for anymore, you don't have the third-party license for it anymore, or something like that. This kind of obsolescence is also a big problem. So those 3.5-inch floppies, it wasn't that many years ago where that was the ubiquitous storage medium for PCs. Now if you go to Fry's and look at the PCs there, you won't find an industry standard PC with a built-in floppy drive, or at least it's really hard to do that. So if you have anything stored on those, you must remove it to something else very soon. So that's a little bit about why this is hard, but it's complicated further because in a lot of cases we don't actually know what we're trying to save and for what purpose. So we might be just trying to save a document, just save the bits and hold them still. But we might be trying to save an application and how it feels to play it, like a video game. How are we going to save that experience into the future? So the question is, how much of the experience are we trying to save of this digital artifact? And the answer is, unfortunately, whatever the customer wants, if they can pay for it. So the answer is yes to all these things, at least in some domain. So a lot of enterprises and organizations out there have static content, but some, like the people who want to keep around video games, have dynamic content. There are lots of people who have very self-contained digital assets that they want to store, but then there are some that have many external dependencies to other services and other kinds of information out there. How do you group all that in, rope that all in, and store that whole thing? And then there's also lots of context, potentially, surrounding the artifact that you might need to store. So different levels of fidelity of the experience and the context surrounding it. So an example would be a copy of a digital book, a very old book. We want to make a digital copy of it. So how much are we going to try to copy here? Maybe we'll just copy the text, just the words, what people think of as the content of the book, the way Google does with a lot of its digital library initiatives. But it might be that this is a lovely old folio of some sort, and we want to be able to preserve the look and feel of the pages, and the fact that somebody 300 years ago made a marginal note about what they ate for breakfast in the corner, and they spilled coffee on it, which meant that coffee was actually available that many hundreds of years ago in that small town in the south of France or something. So there are all sorts of things that we might want to save about this, the actual look and feel of the artifact. There also might be context associated with it, that if we lost it, a lot of the value is gone. So, for instance, this might read as a dusty old tome now, but at the time, perhaps it was a scandalous political text. And if we don't save that information about that context, the context in which people originally read it, then we have lost maybe a big point of what we're supposed to derive from the material. So there's lots of choices here about what we might save. We'd like to be able to save it all. The problem is we can't predict the eventual use of the material, and if we could save everything about it, that would be great. It might be good for all possible uses, but we can't afford to do that. The higher the fidelity that we try to preserve the artifact and more of the context and so forth, the more we're going to pay. And nobody likes to spend a lot of money to save old bits. So the cheaper it is to preserve the content, the more we're going to be able to save. And so there's a big trade-off there. So what if we just tried to save the very simplest thing? Let's just try to take the bits of the artifact, not worry about its context or being able to replay the application, anything like that. Just take those bits and hold them still for a long period of time. That should be the very simplest thing to do, and a lot of people think this is a done deal. Unfortunately, even this is hard. One way of looking at it is if you have a large amount of stuff, so large scale, and over a long time period, those two things combine together to make this a problem. So let's say we had a petabyte of material, a petabyte of bits out there, which is not much for an enterprise these days. And we'd like to be able to save this for, say, 50 years, which we're required to do for various kinds of content. And at the end of that 50 years, we'd like to be able to say that there's only a 50% possibility that the material has been damaged. That doesn't sound like we're really asking for a whole lot there. But if you do the math on that, and I think I did it correctly, that's actually asking for a bit half-life of 10 to the 17th years, which is 1,000,000 times more than people estimate the age of the universe to be. So we're thinking big numbers here. And what this means is that even improbable events, things that you tell yourself aren't going to happen, the fires, the floods, this and that, they will have an effect over scales like this. So even holding the bit still is a problem. Now just try adding in preserving the look and feel of it, the applications, all that other kinds of thing. So this is not a done deal. So I hope I've convinced you at this point that there are things we need to save or want to save, and that it's not a trivial problem to do this, or to figure out how to do this and ensure our success. So if people don't have questions at this point, I'll move on. But if you do have questions, just yell or wave. No. Okay. So now we'll talk a little bit about some of the approaches and how we might evaluate them. After long and bitter experience in this area, here are the key ideas that we've come, some of us, to agree upon as the kind of the fundamental ideas behind how we should approach preservation, at least at the bit level, not necessarily the logical level of the applications and formats and things like that, even just saving the bits. So the first idea, I hope, will seem like common sense to a lot of people, and that's the idea that we're replicating the content. We're going to make copies of it. So we have something we want to save, we'll make a copy of it. So if this copy of it gets damaged, we have another copy from which we can repair this copy or make use of this copy. So we need to make copies. We need to replicate the content. Another point, though, is that we need to avoid failure correlations between these copies. If we put both copies in the same place, and that place gets flooded, then there's no point that we have the copies. They're both gone. So that would be an example of a geographic correlation in the failures. So we might store one here instead of another in New Mexico and another in Australia, and maybe that would break the correlation geographically between our are replicas. But there are other kinds of correlations that people often ignore when putting together these systems, and they're also very important. One, for instance, is administrative correlation between the replicas. If both replicas are in the same administrative domain, that means that one person can make a decision, perhaps an accident, perhaps an insider attack, that destroys both of your replicas. If they have control over both the places where these are stored. So this has actually happened to some very important archives. One in California funded at the taxpayer's expense. They don't want to talk about it because it's exceedingly embarrassing, but you really need to break administrative correlations between the replicas as well, so one person can't mess up everything. Platform dependencies as well. If everything's stored on Windows and somebody finds a back door, then they have a back door into all of your copies. So those are failure correlations. We need to avoid them. And then another point that people often ignore is that not all damage in a system, not all faults will announce themselves or be what we call visible. So we often look at our RAID array, and a red light goes on the disk, and that means that disk has failed, and so a hot standby, the repair process starts, and we know we're going to have to go and replace the disk with the red light on it. That's an example of a visible failure. It announced itself, and a repair process started up. Unfortunately, there are lots of faults out there that don't announce themselves. They're what we call invisible or latent faults. So these are things like maybe that corruption on that CD that's you stored on your shelf with all your pictures on it. You won't know about that until you pick it up and try to use it, perhaps. So, or it could be that you have stored a lot of material and it's all encrypted, and then you forgot the decryption key. That's not something you'll necessarily know that you've failed on until you actually go and try to access the material. So one of the important points here is you need to go and find these latent faults and deal with them before the damage accrues. So we'll talk a lot more about that. These are the basic ideas of what we're going to try to do, though. But the question is, okay, if you have these basic ideas, how do we implement them? So yes, we should replicate the stuff we care about, but how many times? And how reliable should each of those replicas be? How much should this auditing, this proactive looking for otherwise hidden damage, how often should we do that? How much does it help us? How much does it cost? So these are questions that are very hard to answer right now. We need some kind of model to be able to reason about these things to help guide ourselves. So my colleagues and I, we went out and looked at all the modeling work in the storage area, industry, and all the papers and things, looking for something that would help us model reliability, but for the long term. And we came up with zilch. So we have made our own attempt to build a very simple model that would help us here. And I'm sure most people could do better. It's a very primitive model, but it's been able to help us reason about some things, at least, to begin with. What I wanted was a model that would apply to all units of replication. So there are models out there that will tell us about reliability if you're mirroring disks, or you have a certain kind of encoding on your RAID array, or something like that. But I wanted to be able to talk about replication of the content in general and how reliable it was. So I wanted to be able to apply the model regardless of whether it was sectors replicated or files or disks or whole archival sites. So a very coarse-grained model, and I wanted it to apply to lots of different kinds of faults, not just these visible faults, but also these invisible or latent faults that we've talked about. So what we did is we took the RAID model of reliability, and it's okay if you don't have that on the tip of your tongue, what that model is, because you won't need it for this. But we took that model and we extended it to try to account also for latent faults, not just the visible faults, because that model only really accounts for visible faults, disk failures. And we also tried to extend it to account for correlation of faults. Faults both temporally correlated, meaning they happen at the same time, or spatially correlated, meaning they damage the same material in both replicas. So we're going to try to extend the model that way. And it's a very simple, very coarse-grained model. It's not good for getting exact numbers. It's just good, I hope, for roughly evaluating trade-offs and different possibilities. So here's our first approach at putting together this model. The idea is we're going to start with 2 copies of something, 2 replicas. We can add more replicas later, but let's just start with 2. And what we're going to do is we're going to derive the mean time to data loss. That means on average, when is it we're going to lose content in the system, given that we have 2 copies of it. We're going to look at the mean time to data loss of mirrored data in the face of both these visible faults that models have already accounted for and these invisible faults that we're trying to add to the model. So if we have these 2 copies, this mirrored data, whether it's disks or bits or sectors or files or whatever it is, we lose information, the data becomes unrecoverable if this copy fails, and before we've been able to repair it, our other copy fails. That's called the window of vulnerability, the time when this fails, the time between when it fails and when we're able to repair it. That's the window of vulnerability because we're vulnerable to failures of this other copy during that time. So here's a picture of what that looks like. So time is running that way. It almost never runs the other way, I find. It only runs to the right. And graphs only go up and to the right, but you'll see one that goes up and to the left soon, which is different. Anyway, so that's time running that way. And what we're used to thinking about is this first line here. We have a visible failure, something happens, and then there's a recovery period. We're vulnerable during that time to the failure of the other copy. And at the end, we're no longer vulnerable. We're happy if we manage to recover the material and nothing else bad happens during that time. Well, all we've added to this model is the idea that there might be a failure we don't know about, this failure that we haven't actually gone out and found yet. So it's not just the recovery period before we're okay again. We're vulnerable before we found that it exists. There's this detection period here before we know about it. And we would like that to be very small. Unfortunately, it could be indefinitely long if we're not going out and looking for it. So if we have these two copies and we have this idea of what we're vulnerable to, when do we lose data? This is the basic, this is a picture of the model. So in this upper left-hand quadrant here, this is what we're used to thinking about with failures in storage. There's a visible failure, and during the recovery period, the other copy suffers a failure. We're toast. So we're used to that. What we've added here really is that there might be a visible failure, and we're recovering from the other copy, and the other copy has damage to it that we don't know about. We haven't found that damage yet. So we might actually propagate the damage, recover it, and spread it to a healthy system. That does happen. Or it could be there's damage we don't know about in a copy, and before we manage to find and repair that damage, our other system fails visibly. We lose the disk that held the good copy of the material. Even if we find the damage now, we don't have anything to repair it with. Or it could be that we suffer two latent faults. There's invisible damage in both copies, and we don't know about it. That's a rare case, but it can happen. So that's what the model looks like. The overall probability of data loss is the sum of each of those cases. But that overstates the problem a little bit, because that's just looking at temporal correlation, that things failed at the same time. The question is, do they actually fail and hurt the same material in both copies? So in an array-to-array model of reliability, often people don't worry so much about that because they think of the units just being a disk. But here we're worried about all sorts of different kinds of units of replication. So let's say that first rectangle up there is our first replica, replica 1, and this next one is replica 2. And the gray areas are where there's some damage. So it's only where those gray areas overlap that we've actually lost information in the system, which is what's represented here in red. So this is the overall information in the system. We've only lost it where the damage happens at the same time and we can't repair it and it occurs to the same material. So it could be that we've had bit rot in the same file in both replicas for some reason, or it could be that both were stored in a format that we can no longer read, or it could be that we've lost the decryption key in both of them, something like that. In any case, we lose information in the whole overall system. And the point here is that the smaller the areas of damage, the less likely they are to overlap. So if we can find and fix things before they get too big, there's less likelihood that they'll overlap and that we'll lose information. To complete the model, we just multiply the temporal and spatial probabilities there for each of those 4 loss cases. To handle correlation, we don't do an elegant job of that. We just use multiplicative scaling factors to account for temporal correlation of faults, meaning they're more likely than they would be if they were entirely random, and spatial correlation of faults. These are fudge factors right now because we don't have any good measurements about the strength of correlations in a lot of different kinds of systems. Those are very system dependent. And we also extend the model further for higher degrees of replication. And I won't go into any of the math. You're welcome to look at papers I can point you to if you want to see that. But that's the basic idea of the model. So how would this help us evaluate these techniques to try to preserve the material? Well, one of the questions we asked early on was, okay, it looks like we want to search for this invisible damage before it accrues, but how much does it really help us to shorten this detection time in a real system? So what we did is we were fortunate enough to be able to work with the Internet Archive up in San Francisco, real archive, and work with a portion of it and the recordings they had made of different kinds of faults. So how many of you know about the Internet Archive? Good. Oh, good. Excellent. Yes, so some people didn't, so I'll just very briefly tell you that it's a nonprofit organization up in San Francisco that stores lots of stuff, lots of different kinds of collections of independent music and videos and things like that. One of their really interesting collections, at least for me, is what they call their Wayback Machine. And the Wayback Machine, they started this in 1996, I believe, and it's a monthly snapshot of the web, essentially. They go out and they snapshot all the web pages they get their hands on and save those. So you can go back and look at what happened in April 1996 on Yahoo's front page. Or if there's a website out there, like the website I love, George Gobel's barbecue site where he blew things up with liquid oxygen and things like that. Sites out there that have been removed or been lost over time, you can actually go look them up there and see them again, at least in many cases. So this is a fascinating archive, and these snapshots that they take of all these web pages, they gather together a whole lot of them and put them into a file, an archival file, and those files then should be static over time. They should be immutable. Those were snapshots of a point in time. You can't change history, in theory at least. So those files, we had access to information about 1.5 million of them, which doesn't account for the whole archive, but it was a good chunk of it at the time. Those files were spread out over about 1,800 ATA drives, so not enterprise-level drives, but the kinds of drives you might hook up to your PC. And they weren't in RAID arrays or anything like that. They were just a bunch of disks hooked up to servers. They took logs of different kinds of failures. And so for them, the visible failures were disk failures. And the caveat here, a disk failure in many of these cases doesn't necessarily mean that the disk was toast. It could be send it back to the manufacturer and they say there's nothing wrong, we just have to fix a bug in the firmware or something like that. What a disk failure meant to them, though, was that they felt it was expedient to replace the disk. It was causing them enough trouble that they needed to replace it. So you can think of this disk failure as being actually disk replacement time. And what they found was that on average, they needed to replace a disk every 20 hours. Now, it may sound like a high number. I just saw eyebrows go up. It may sound like a high number. This is a non-profit organization. In many ways, a lot of people working there. It's a labor of love. So you might say that, well, their IT environment, and they had some troubles periodically with their IT environment. I mean, you might say that in an enterprise that can throw lots of money at IT, that you'd be able to do much better in that 20 hours. But actually, that number isn't so far off what we see in a lot of installations if you actually look at disk replacement times. So they were actually doing a fair job of this. So it's not out of the ballpark by any means. It's just a lot of people don't like to talk about how often these things fail, especially vendors of disk drives. So, okay, so that's the visible failures. But they also did something very interesting. They went and they checksummed, took fingerprints of these supposedly immutable files every month and stored logs of those on a separate system. And they very graciously gave us access to those logs, and we processed them. And there were lots of things we had to remove from them. There were cases when it was the fingerprinting mechanism had a bug in it. But what we did is we narrowed it down through lots of other sources of information to those cases where the fingerprint on a supposedly immutable file changed, and the file had actually changed. And it shouldn't have changed. And if it hadn't been for the fact that we had that checksum information there, we wouldn't have known, because that file might not have been accessed for a long time, or maybe it was and nobody cared, or something like that. So this was, in a way, making these latent faults visible through this checksumming process. So those are what we consider to be the latent faults in the system, because if it hadn't been for that checksumming process, we wouldn't have known about them. And what we found there was that the mean time to a latent fault in the system was about 1,500 hours. At the time that we did this, most people believed you never saw corruption of that sort in files. There were all sorts of arguments about why you couldn't see that. Anybody who actually built the disk would tell you, yes, you could, because they knew what they were dealing with in the way of the actual materials and mechanics. But there was an awful lot of hocus-pocus going on saying that you wouldn't actually see these kinds of faults, but we did see them, and the Internet Archive knows that they saw them. And since then, there have been several interesting studies that have come out that I can point you to that have found evidence of this in all sorts of other places as well. So, using our model, what can it tell us about the benefits of auditing something like this checksum process to find these latent faults? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's take the Internet Archive, that portion of it that we have numbers for, and let's say we replicate it. So we have a chance to repair the damage from one copy if we find that it's happened in another copy. So we'll replicate it, and then we'll see if we audit for these latent faults at different intervals, how much does it help us? So on this axis here, we have the mean time to data loss in years, which means the higher the number of the years, the better we're doing, the longer it's taken on average for us to suffer loss of information in the system. And on this axis, we have the frequency with which we look through the archive and look for these changes in files. So this is the auditing interval, more frequently at this end, less frequently at that end. So you see this is a curve that actually goes up and to the left. I probably should have arranged it to go the other way, because usually up and to the right means best. So the blue line down here is what would happen if we did no auditing at all for these latent faults. We just said, we don't care, let the damage accrue. What's our mean time to data loss? So between the visible and latent faults in the system, we lose information on average in something under a year, which is not very impressive. If we start, well, let's see. First, this pink line up there, what is the best we could do? Well, the best we could do would be is if there were no latent faults at all, none of that kind of damage. We only had disk failures, the kinds of things that we're used to. So there's no point in auditing because we only have to worry about disk failures. The best we could do then, if we had no latent faults at all, is that pink line up there, which is something close to, I think it's 18.6 years. So much better. May not sound all that great for an archive, but that's actually a pretty good number if you only have 2 replicas. And the yellow line here is what happens to our mean time to data loss if we begin to audit at increasing frequencies. So you can see we can actually get really close to the ideal. But in a system like this, the more you go and audit, you're also causing wear and tear to the system. That amount of wear and tear will be different depending on the kind of system. So you'll have to take this next number with a bit of a grain of salt because it will be very system dependent. But we try to put that in the model as well. And that's what the red crosses are, is to try to account for the wear and tear in the system as we bring up the level of auditing. So the particular number, ignore, but the basic idea is there'll be some knee in the curve there, a frequency beyond which you shouldn't go because you'll be doing more harm than good in the system. So that tells us that overall, yes, it looks like auditing is a good idea. Doesn't take into account other kinds of costs and things like that, but purely in terms of avoiding damage in the system, it appears to be a good idea. So implications that we derive from our use of this model, not just that example, but some other things as well. The first one is, yes, you've got to replicate the content if you want to keep a copy of it around, because in these long time periods, disasters will happen. So it's not enough just to say we're going to make one really good, super reliable copy, because something will happen to that copy over the long term. Replicas should also be as independent as possible, and I didn't pull out the model itself to show you this, but if you look at the model, if there's any reason to believe it, you'll see that any gains from extra levels of replication in the model are offset by correlations between those replicas. So it's very important to avoid those failure correlations. That means that heterogeneity between the replicas is a good thing if we care about long-term preservation. The problem is the storage industry as a whole is moving towards consolidation and homogeneity of our digital assets and storage systems. And that's for cost reasons, because that makes it less costly to maintain things. So there's a real tension here between cutting costs and what we actually need to do to be able to preserve the material for a long time. So of all the sticking points here, I think that's probably the biggest one. And anything we can do to make that heterogeneity less costly will benefit us. And there are places and contexts where we can do that because of the independence of the organizations that are actually hosting the material. If you can exploit that, great. If you can't, this is a question here. The other issue was finding and fixing those latent faults before damage accrues. We want to shorten that detection time to find those invisible faults. We need to proactively go out and audit to find anything that's going on in our data that we don't want to have happen. Not just for bit corruption, but for these other things like formats that are about to become endangered, so we have time, say, to migrate to another format, rekeying things, all sorts of things like that. What this means is for us to be able to audit and repair this way, that means the content has to be accessible. It has to be easily and cheaply accessible. We have to be able to get at it on a relatively frequent basis, which means you can't just put it onto some kind of high latency offline storage medium and go and store it in a cave or salt mine. it's going to cost vastly too much to get that material back to be able to repair from it or audit it. So it might be great in terms of heterogeneity to have another copy stored that way, but you're not going to be able to rely upon it for purposes of repair in a costly manner, in a less costly manner. So that is a huge point for the storage industry right now. So that gives us some ideas of best practices if we care about preserving this material for a long period of time. One of the interesting things, though, that I want to make sure that everybody's had time to think about here is that best practices will change over time. In the world of storage and computers in general, we can't predict what's going to change. We can't say what's going to happen. We only know that it will change. So the ability to evolve is probably the single most important aspect of digital preservation, that we be able to change as time goes along to preserve the material. What this means is that the processes and practices that people use, these are key. People will tell you all about a magic format you could use. That means, everybody's going to use this format for the rest of the time, so your material's safe if you store it in this format. Or that we're going to use virtual machines to be able to replay, the x86 architecture forever, and so we never have to worry about applications that run on that. There are all sorts of theories out there, all of which might perhaps be applicable in some cases, but I can almost guarantee there'll be a point with that, at some point, where that no longer works. So the real key here is that we be able to evolve our processes. And what that means is that the current processes and practices that we put in place, those are just the first step. They're just what we can do to get ourselves to the next point at which we probably will have to change what we do. Migrate to new formats, or we have a whole different world of quantum computing, or something like that. So something will change. We just have to get ourselves to that next step and then make our decisions about what we're going to do next. Another point I want to make, if you find yourself actually working in this area, is that the processes that organizations use, it's very dependent on particular organizations as to what they can be successful with. You're not going to be able to walk into an organization that's only ever put things on tape and doesn't believe in spinning disk except for a tiny bit of their data or something. You're not going to be able to go in there and say, move everything to spinning disk. It's going to have to be an evolutionary process, even to move people in the right direction with processes for digital preservation. And another point is that because of this need to be able to evolve, it is very helpful to use widely understood, widely used, and I hope not proprietary formats and processes. So, many years out, if there's a danger of losing the license to run some kind of proprietary application, or the business goes kerplunk, you're in trouble. So you really want to use, if you can, open standards and widely applied formats, because at least that means there's a whole lot of you out there that are sharing the same problem, and so it's a problem that's more likely to be addressed with some amount of money. So what this means is that a good archive is almost always moving. There's always something happening. You're migrating to new formats, you're auditing, you're rekeying, you're doing something like that. It's always doing something to help keep this material and get it to the next step. And that means that digital preservation, even though you think you're just trying to hold those bits still, perhaps, digital preservation is not a static thing. You can't just say, okay, I preserved this material, we're done with it. You're going to have to keep at it, which is unfortunate, but that's what we have to do if we care about it. So I think I have, is it 5 more minutes? Is that about right? So if people have questions about that material, please ask. Yes?
I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around this model where someone needs to be actively working on keeping the material the whole time, because from a historical perspective, we just have thousands and thousands of cases where really important material was discovered in someone's attic, in an old book, or even more recently, lots of historically significant software wasn't contributed to archives by the companies that wrote them. It was contributed by someone who had a tape in their garage.
You're absolutely right. So one of the huge questions is, what are you going to save? Who's saving it? And lots of things that we consider of value, the person who had it didn't, or didn't care about it, or didn't know what to do with it, or didn't have the money to do anything with it. There are many, many examples of that.
So when your employer decides this archive that we're maintaining, this petabyte archive that we're maintaining isn't worth the money to keep migrating to new storage every 10 years,
toast.
How does an individual who cares about it somehow preserve it?
So actually individuals can pull something out of this. So if you personally have material that, if you don't have access to that material, then, then maybe nothing you can do about it. But your own personal material, I'll tell you what I do. I keep it on 3 different sets of spinning discs in 3 different places. And I actually audit between it. My baby photos of my kids aren't going anywhere. So actually, the 3 different sets are all in North America, so, there are still issues, right? But if it comes to that, then I've probably lost the kids too, right? So, so you can actually, as a person, try to take care of your material using some of these principles. And I think one of the points you're bringing up is the cost. And the custodianship.
That's the big one. It's such an active thing, right? If I stop caring, and my great-grandkids have an interest, right, if they find my photo album that no one's paid attention to for 100 years, they're still good.
Right.
If they find my discs that no one's plugged in for 100 years, they've got a problem.
Right. So the custodianship is the issue, and the technology can only go so far to address it. So when I say that this is an active archive, it's doing something, my hope, and in some cases we've had some success, is it can be active without us having to fuss with it. Now, there will be some point where we do, because it may be able to recognize we no longer have this third-party license, or it's time to renew a license, or it may be able to recognize that, I'm seeing less and less of this format. Nobody's adding material of this format anymore, so maybe this format is becoming endangered. It probably can't tell us what to migrate it to, but it can maybe raise a red flag. Who is going to see that red flag, and do they care, I think, is the big problem, the problem of custodianship. And so that's a problem that's really best discussed with, currently, with preservationists of physical artifacts. And so, you go to a museum and you think that there are wonderful records of what's kept and when it's been repaired and things like that. Museums lose stuff all the time, or actually they get rid of it because they have to be able to bring in new stuff. It costs too much to preserve the old stuff. So a lot of times they get rid of it. And when people find this out, they object terribly. But cost is a problem. So we even in places that are developed solely for the purpose of preservation, we still have this problem with the continuity of custodianship. That's not something I can solve. All I can try to do is bring down the costs, if someone cares, of trying to get them to the point where they might have to do a handoff. And we can do a little bit to try to make it so that handoff is as easy to understand as possible. So it doesn't require as much documentation as it might otherwise require. It's not an entirely satisfactory answer. I agree. But
it's like if you compare the spinning discs to, say, punch tape or paper tape, I mean, that's got the nice advantage that as long as it hasn't been destroyed, if it's ignored for 100 years, there's still some hope.
So there's a wonderful model for you to look at. And it's a model that was developed by the National Archives of Australia. And the model looks at the artifact and the person or user or consumer of that artifact, the ones who experience that artifact. And the question is, what is in between? What is in the way of this person experiencing that artifact? So you open a book, and if you can read the language still or understand how they draw the letters or whatever it is, there's very little between you and understanding that artifact. With paper tape, if you understand the encoding, and in many cases it was simple enough that you could probably reconstruct it given enough time, although with some of them it could be hard. But paper tape was used even in the 19th century for sending telegrams and things. So it's an ancient format in that sense. So you might be able to, there's less in between you and it to some extent. You might be able to get that far, although you'd have to build a reader to do it, and there aren't many of those lying around. Between you and the magnetic coatings on some of the more modern storage media, tapes and things like that, there's a lot between you and being able to experience the artifact. Yeah. So the idea is how much process is there between you and it. And as that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the more and more trouble we get into. And there is work that is trying very hard to address that problem. We don't know if it's going to be successful. There's a project called SURF that's a cooperative project with some folks at SNIA and CASPER, which is part of one of the European Union research projects. SURF stands for, oh dear.
Google it.
Actually, you don't see it very often. You'll see a couple mentions of it on Google, but it's hard to get from that to its actual name. In any case, I can send you a write-up of it. It hasn't been published yet, about their attempts to develop a format that's self-explanatory, that works its way down eventually to a format that's very primitive, basically just ASCII. Nice. And you use that to explain the more complicated formats as you go forward at the time.
Because
Okay, I guess I won't talk about the projects, but that was an excellent question. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to stay behind or out in the hallway or whatever and talk about it.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.